I'm Colin Campbell, and I want to first express my appreciation to the organizers of this opportunity for this lecture. I'm going to try something really pretty tough, it would appear to be, connecting three exceedingly complex concepts. One, human health. Secondly, environmental health. And in turn, how those two in turn relate to a third very complicated matter, food choice. Now, we all can agree, I think, that we have some system-wide problems in our society these days. I've shown two groups of problems, one having to do with environmental problems, the second having to do with human health problems. And obviously, I'm listing only just some. I could put more here, but these are enough to make the point. We tend to work in these sort of silos of ideas in each of these areas, environmental health and human health. And we could spend hours and hours and days just talking about any one of these topics. But quite frankly, I'm grouping them here, as I said, as environmental health, human health, and posing the question. Do each of these topics have their own independent causes? Since we tend to work on them one by one, we tend to think that way. Or is it possible that they have one overriding cause? I'm going to suggest there's an overriding cause. It's the food we choose to eat. And just by way of summary up front, we'll say, consume plants, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and nuts. And in the process, while we're consuming these plants, consume them as much as possible in the whole food form. Now, what that means, that doesn't mean intact food. We can chop it up, we can cook it, we can do all kinds of things with food. But what I'm basically saying when I say whole food, I'm talking about simultaneously consuming all of the nutrients in food at one time. So the body in turn has an opportunity to pick and choose which kind of nutrient it wants to do with what it wants to do with it. So in a sense, I'm attempting to derive simplicity, a simple message if possible, from this extraordinary complexity. I'm kind of excited about the possibility that's really possible. But searching for simple truths in a complex system, I'm sure you can appreciate, is very complex to say the least. But I'm going to suggest right up front, to make it tough, that this complex system is controlled by what I would call a trifecta of industry, government, and academic interests. Think of it this way. In a sense, try swimming upstream under these conditions like this, and you might get some idea what I'm talking about. Actually, we don't know what we don't know. And for the most part, most of us, we don't even bother asking. We don't even recognize that we don't know something, in a sense. That's part of the struggle of putting this together. Now, I have to take you back to my own personal journey in this field, because the way I just happened to have done it, not purposely, but the way I did it, sort of illustrated what I'm now talking about. My own personal background was being raised on a farm. My father was a farmer, and I milked cows until I went away to school, actually. And in fact, just in 1956, my dad decided to sell the herd, and 3 months later, I was at Cornell University graduate school. We were, of course, on the farm harvesting grain for cow feed, which in turn provided milk, obviously. I drank a lot of it, presumably for its animal protein content. I didn't think of it that way in those days. Nobody really did, but that was the purpose of drinking milk in part, was to make sure we got enough protein. Then later, when I was in graduate school at Cornell, during my doctoral dissertation, I focused on the idea of promoting the consumption of more animal proteins. So valuable was that nutrient, if you will. Then in my first academic position, thereafter, 1965 at Virginia Tech, I was asked to be responsible for integrating or coordinating a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. Malnourished children, incidentally, in those days, we tended to think of nutrition The primary problem was they weren't getting enough protein. So, in a sense, in my training, and then my first responsibility, it was all about basically promoting the consumption of more animal protein. That was supposed to be the big solution to a lot of problems. But I saw something there that didn't quite square with that idea. I saw that among the few families in the Philippines who consumed the most protein, like we do in the West, their children had a higher risk of getting liver cancer of all things. Then I saw this paper in India, an experimental animal study of rats in this case, where they did a study to test whether or not giving more protein, like 20% of total calories, for example, would actually repress the formation of liver cancer. And the 20% of protein was sort of the regular levels. They were compared with the 5% low levels in a model where the cancer was started by a carcinogen. But what they saw was something really quite opposite what they thought they might see. Namely, the animals given more protein, 100% got the liver cancer. I mean, both groups are given the same amount of carcinogen, but the animals given the 20% protein, they're the ones who got the cancer, not the ones given 5%. This was published in 1968. That combined with my impression of the children having more liver cancer risk for consuming more protein was what kicked off my career. So it was really, what was seen here was something exactly the opposite of what I had been raised to believe without even knowing it, and what I certainly got involved in as far as my training is concerned, namely running into this idea that increasing protein, that was a crazy idea by anyone's standards. So I organized a program back home with the National Institutes of Health funding, that's NIH funding, that lasted for the next 30 years at least. And we did lots and lots of studies. And the idea was to first determine whether, is it really true that higher protein feeding might increase liver cancer? Here's just one chart showing that over the first 12 weeks of feeding experimental animals, in this case, rats, feeding experimental animals, 2 different levels of protein, 20% and 5%. And the cancer was started by a mutation, but feeding 20% protein among these animals gave rise to an early growth of the cancer, 5% not. I mean, that's huge. That's a huge effect. Then we did something more. I just switched the diets back and forth during that time. I mean, it was hard to believe that this is really true, that more protein meant more cancer. And the protein we were using in this case, by the way, was the dairy protein casein. So what we learned during the first 12 weeks, I could switch the diet back and forth between 20 and 5% and turn it on, turn it off. Elevate protein, turn it on, and then turn it off. I mean, these are all the same animals. So it turned out the development of the cancer was very responsive to this animal protein effect. It also showed something here pretty spectacular at that time, and still today, I would suggest, that nutrition, rather than genes, in other words, they all start with the mutated gene back here, but nutrition actually primarily controls the development of the cancer. So the next question was, I mean, this was such a stark observation. I didn't know whether to drop it or not, but there it was. It was so stark. I decided the next thing to do, and that's what we do in research, was to try to understand the biochemical or physiological mechanism responsible for this protein effect. Because if we can understand the mechanism, then possibly, in theory, we might develop a drug to block the effect, if you will. So I'm going to show you here work that occurred over, 12, 13, 14 years or so, where we systematically were searching for the mechanism responsible for the protein effect. And in those days in cancer research, we tended to think of cancer as being comprised of 3 different stages. Initiation is the first stage where the mutation forms to start the cancer. The promotion is the second stage, where now when the early cancer cells are formed, they start dividing, growing, and that's promotion. And the third stage, in the case of humans at least, that's when we discover we've got a problem, usually because the cancer by that time has metastasized to another tissue. So we got 3 stages: initiation, promotion, progression. And what we did systematically over some years, usually involving a graduate student's doctoral dissertation in most of these cases, what we did over a number of years was to determine, if we could, what was the mechanism? What was the mechanism, the key mechanism? So we started looking for mechanisms by which the high protein diet caused cancer. And in the first stage, during this initiation of the cancer, if you will, when a mutation is forming, the high protein diet increased the entry of the carcinogen into the cell. It increased the enzyme activity, called mixed functional oxidase, increased the enzyme activity that actually activated that carcinogen, that then in turn created a product that was very active, it bound to DNA very tightly, and that was the beginning of a mutation. So we looked at all these things, these items here separately. Each one of them is complex. And thirdly, when this goes on a routine basis in our bodies, we're always, binding carcinogens to our DNA, which is stuff of genes. We have a mechanism there that actually decreases that or repairs that damage, and we call it DNA repair. So the high protein diet, every time we looked for one of these mechanisms here, we found one. That was the first stage. The second stage, in promotion, we did the same thing again. Go through here, and I found a bunch of different mechanisms. I couldn't, by that time, decide which mechanism was the key mechanism. In the second one, by the way, what really happened was that when look at it in its totality, we found that the high protein diet increased 8 mechanisms that normally enhance cancer development. So feeding high protein increased each of those mechanisms, and it decreased 2 mechanisms shown here in yellow, DNA repair and natural killers activity. It decreased those. So the high protein diet was increasing some, decreasing others, but they all resulted in the same thing. They all worked in synchrony to show how a high protein diet increases cancer. Really quite remarkable. I mean, this whole process seemed to be it was almost like a symphony. They all worked together. Feeding more protein turned on all these, or turned them on, turned them off, so all these mechanisms. But at the end of the day, it increased cancer. So much for that. By that time, I'm getting convinced this high protein diet really does cause an increase in cancer. No question about it. So now I just show you how this in turn, at least in later years, how this became to be related to human studies. We're going to show you some charts here produced by other researchers over that period of time. This one here happens to be in 1959, where a researcher was examining the relationship between protein intake, that's on the bottom, percent protein intake, percent of calories, that, for different countries. These dots here are all for different countries. And what he found at that time, he and his workers found, was that as the protein is increased for different countries, we tended to see this fairly straight line relationship for more cancer with more protein. Here's another research group, for example, that found a high dietary protein increase, in this case, kidney cancer, renal cancer. Here's one where non-fat milk. It shows, again, this really straight line relationship between non-fat milk consumption and prostate cancer. Humans, these are all separate studies, but showing essentially the same lines. There's one on saturated fat and breast cancer deaths. See it once again. Here's one, we have to flip the 2 axes, in this case, the cholesterol intake, showing the y-axis in this case, but a higher cholesterol intake increased the death rate for coronary heart disease, CHD. You can see there again. And finally, in this case here, meat consumption being related to colon cancer. One more, total fat intake being related to urine cancer. Mind you, these charts, I've just pulled these together fairly recently, just to make the point. All these charts seem to show various and sundry relationships. These relationships are all linear regressions, we call them. The lines go straight down. I drew the lines, best fit lines. They all come down somewhere near this XY origin, suggesting that the addition of any of these dietary factors began to theoretically increase the risk of all these different cancers. So I'm going to suggest for your thinking that even though they all look to be different, like meat intake and total fat intake and so forth and so on, cholesterol intake, meat intake, total fat, low fat milk, they all appear to be separate. They are in a sense. These are really all surrogates. They're all indicators, quite frankly, of one thing, animal protein. And incidentally, it's only for animal protein, not plant protein. Here's a plot here showing the consumption of plant protein intake with breast cancer. And you can see the relationship. So this relationship of protein with these diseases, cancer, heart disease, and so forth, the relationship was focused, what was directly related to the consumption of animal protein. By the way, I should point out that when we consume more animal protein in the form of animal food, of course, when we consume more animal food to get that good protein, as it goes up, plant protein goes down. Okay, so keep that in mind. When we see these relationships for animal protein, it's not the protein by itself that's working. We got a combination of things going on here. Animal protein is increased, animal food, plant protein is decreased. And in plant foods, there we got the good stuff. There we've got the good stuff. So there's a combination effect, if you will. So I want to raise now a question. Where from did we have this desire for more protein? Where did this come from? Especially our desire for consuming so-called high-quality protein. High-quality protein generally consumed in the economically affluent countries like the United States, Europe, etc. High-quality protein also being the kind of protein found in animal food, okay? Animal protein is considered to be high quality. Plant protein is considered to be low quality. It doesn't work quite as efficiently, if you will. And that idea, incidentally, is almost at a subconscious, almost an unconscious level for the public at large. We tend to think that protein, or at least a lot of people think that protein is only found in animal foods. It's not very true. It's found in plant foods too. But to the extent that, even if we become at that level of awareness that protein is both in plant and animal, we still jump for the protein in animal food because it is high quality. That is an old idea that's been around for a long time. In fact, here's a gentleman in 1839, a Dutch chemist, who discovered protein initially. He was doing a dog experiment, found out that the dog survived by eating meat. And he, at that time, was interested in finding out if he could isolate some chemical in that food that would account for that effect on meat and keeping these dogs alive. And he isolated what he called protein. And that word protein, by the way, you had to make up a new word at the time. That was taken from the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance. So I say it like this. Protein was baptized right in the beginning with its naming. It was baptized as being a chemical that was of prime importance. Why? Why is that? I mean, I could go on, there's worth another couple of lectures on this particular point. But at that time, there was almost a reverence for eating animal food in and of itself, just to make for human health. And what this gentleman found was that he found the chemical he thought that accounted for that effect. So what is this protein? It's a protein of animal food. Why is it considered high quality? Let me suggest something here that for you thinking that almost no one ever stops to think about, quite frankly, whether they're in science or not in science. High quality protein really specifically represents a higher proportion of the consumed protein that's actually being retained in the body. So of the total protein consumed at any point in time, when a higher proportion is retained by the body, which is also called biological value, that is called quality. In other words, the body's retaining more protein for its use, whatever it does, that's considered high quality. That's where the word comes from. High quality protein associated with animal protein simply represents a higher proportion of the protein being retained in the tissues. Animal proteins, as I've already inferred, has a higher retention of protein, a higher proportion of the protein being retained. That's called higher quality. Plant proteins, lower retention, lower quality. That incidentally kind of led to the idea early on to some folks that the only way that plant proteins ain't good, you had to combine them some way. Well, it was silly. Turns out plant proteins are enough, provide all the protein we need, but let's set that aside for the moment. The animal proteins independently of themselves, egg protein, milk protein, meat protein, you name it. Animal proteins, a higher percentage is retained. That was actually started by a professor at the University of Illinois by the H.H. Mitchell, published in 1924. And he's the one that just originally sort of defined, if you will, scientifically, what high quality protein really meant. Higher protein retention. It basically meant for him and other scientists at the time, greater body weight gain. As you could see in rat studies or pig studies, consuming more protein at a little faster rate of growth. That's good that makes for more profit for animal production. Not good for humans, really, but that's what they assume. More growth, higher animal protein, big deal. Make more profit. Incidentally, I should point out, not just as an aside, this H.H. Mitchell, by the way, 11 years before, had participated in a conversation to suggest that those races in the world that weren't getting enough of this high quality protein, stuck in the low protein diet, they were racially inferior. You can imagine. That really kicked off a storm at the time. He was considered the Japanese, for example, racially inferior. And so I point this out because the idea of consuming animal protein, and really only real protein in a sense, was actually racially superior. This is meant for racially superior people. Here's something that was missed. And even today, almost no one is talking. I don't know if anyone really talking about it this way. Higher animal protein, that's more being retained from the animal, more protein being retained, but in the case of animal food, it does something else other than stimulate body growth. It increases the production of growth hormone, which is associated with more cancer. Higher protein being retained in the body means more estrogen, the female hormone, which in turn, if that goes up, that's associated with breast cancer. We saw that in a study in China that we did. And it did some other things. The higher animal protein also creates the formation of so-called free radicals, oxygen-free radicals, very active substances that can actually stimulate aging, catalyze a faster rate of cancer growth. Higher animal protein increases cancer mutations, but mind you, it decreases, more being retained, it decreases the production of natural killer cells, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And it decreases DNA repair. So the good things we got working for us, that higher animal protein decrease them. All of these things here, higher retention, which means higher quality, also higher quality, good deal, it decreases cancer. All of these things here relate to an increase in cancer. At the same time, if we retain more of the protein, it increases also serum cholesterol, total cholesterol, and the bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, which in turn relates to heart disease. Incidentally, this has been more or less known for over a century, but it's been ignored. The high animal protein consumption increases the level of cholesterol in our blood, the bad cholesterol in particular, which increases heart disease. And one more, among many, I'm just listing some things here. More protein being retained to give that high quality characteristic to it. It also is associated with increasing blood sugar and A1C, which is a lab indicator of diabetes. So here we have higher protein consumption being related to more cancer, more heart disease, more diabetes, and on and on and on. This is just what. So my question is this. Is this idea of retaining more protein that makes it high quality, is that a good thing? Just because we can grow faster, which is problematic in and of itself? At the same time, we're increasing cancer risk and heart disease risk and diabetes risk. So now let me jump from that idea, questioning, our consumption of protein, especially the kind of protein we consume. Now I'll talk about something else. Talking about consuming plants. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating the consumption of animal foods because of its protein content. But in any case, I want to talk about a second idea. I call it one of the keystones, one of the dietary keystones, and that is consuming plants in the whole food form. Again, as I pointed out before, consuming food in the form in which all of its nutrients are more or less consumed in one setting. Now, this idea of wholeness sort of was brought to my attention And by publication in 1981, when it first came out, it was rather a shocking study, but I thought it was kind of interesting because at that time we were just turning cancer on and off experimentally, and this came out. What this shows here is that for smokers, and the amount of smoking is indicated on this axis, smokers from those who did not consume smoking over a 30-year period, those who consumed less than 30 years, and those who consume 30 years or more. In any case, as they increase the smoking, lung cancer, here we go, lung cancer is going up, right? It's going up. But in addition, among the smokers, among the people, all of whom are smokers, among all these heavy smokers, they also measured something else at the same time. They measured the level of beta carotene in the blood. Beta carotene consumption. They measure the level of beta carotene consumption. Now, beta carotene is vitamin A, okay? It's only made in plants. So what they found that among the heavy smokers, all smoking for 30 years or more, those who had more beta carotene that were consuming more beta carotene, more plants, look at their lung cancer risk decline, a straight line relationship, really, really impressive. So smokers, if they were consuming plants and getting all that beta carotene and lots of other things too, so they had, but for this study, beta carotene, it suggested that beta carotene would be protective against the formation of lung cancer. So from that observation, it caused a lot of interest at the time amongst the folks. I took an interest in it because of some of our own work at the time, but some others got interested to suggest that maybe beta carotene looked like it was a good thing. And maybe if we just took a bunch of smokers, did a study, and then gave them beta carotene in a tablet form, we could prevent them from getting lung cancer. So a study was organized among 29,000 male smokers. This was a joint Finnish US study at the time. They intended to carry it out for over a period of 8 years, but they had to stop it early, around 5 years, because of these results here. What they found in this study, among these 29,000 male smokers, those who consumed beta carotene in the food, yes, they saw a decrease in lung cancer that was statistically significant. In other words, consuming more plants, lower risk of lung cancer. And they saw that effect in a shorter period of time as 5 years' time. In contrast, the beta carotene put in a supplement, you just take it like that, actually increased lung cancer, also statistically significant. What this suggested to me at the time was that, and not to me, but others too, that nutrients, they're really important. But nutrients are an important part of food, obviously, but even a good thing like beta carotene, when it's in food, it decreases disease risk. But when it's taken separately, like in a beta carotene tablet, it increases risk. That led to quite a remarkable observation over some years that I call it this holism. When it's in the food, when the nutrients are in the food, I call it holism, everything working together. When you take the nutrient out, even though it's good, you take it out, put a supplement, reduce it, just looking at one thing at a time, that's called reduction. And then thereafter, there were some more studies that showed something similar. Look at this. Vitamin E, when it's in a nutrient supplement, increases hemorrhagic stroke by 74% in one study. Calcium and vitamin D increases cardiovascular events. Vitamin E increases prostate cancer. These are just a few observations. I really got caught up in the nutrient supplement business in those days because I was asked to actually be the so-called expert sitting in administrative court hearings as to the claims being made by industry who wanted to promote supplements. And I was being asked to give my opinion on whether or not these supplements work. So there's a lot of studies that started coming out showing that nutrients in the form of supplements do not usually do the same thing. In fact, in some cases, they might actually cause a reverse effect. In any case, time passed, and finally, in 2002 or 3 or so, when I got involved with my son, my youngest son, who's now a physician himself, Tom Campbell, we co-authored a book called The China Study. And at the time we were doing that study, I went back and looked at the literature to see if some of the things that we were learning over the years, might have appeared in other studies. And what I found, and I'm summarizing here very briefly, that some previous studies, without the authors knowing exactly calling this thing, but a lot of studies showed that when whole food, plant-based diets are fed, they can either prevent, suspend, or cure all these diseases. In other words, these are observations in prior years that suggested that consuming plants as food in one way or another, was associated with lower disease risk by consuming more plants. The effect was broad. I call it the whole food plant-based diet. The effect is broad. It's rapid. We can see when people are on the verge of being diagnosed with some of these diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and kidney stones and so forth, if you put them then on a plant-based diet, that you can start to see disease turnaround, reversal, if you will, very, very quickly. My good friends, Dr. Colin and Dr. Ornish, Dr. John McDougall at the time, had done some of these kind of stuff to show that it's a very rapid change that occurs. And if the dietary change is sustained, then now we're talking about, not just disease reversal, we're talking about treating illness with no side effects. And this is an altogether different topic. I could go on and on about this, but using drugs to treat disease has side effects. Using diet or food, in contrast, does not cause any side effects. So I end up with this generalized summary, if you will, of nutrition, what it is. I call it holist nutrition. Nutrition is not about working on one nutrient at a time or assuming that one nutrient is going to do something special. It's really, nutrition is about eating a whole food, getting all the nutrients simultaneously. That's why I come back to this point of trying to make this point that consuming food in the whole food form, given nature, given our bodies the opportunity to let it choose what it wants to do, whatever it wants to do with it, but consume it in a whole food form. So holistic nutrition involves multiple nutrients. When I say multiple nutrients, I'm talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of nutrient-like substances that will kind of work together. Each nutrient has multiple mechanisms that I just showed a moment ago. And they have an effect on an array, spectrum of disease types. And of course, at the same time, they're preventing these diseases. They're also increasing, there's multiple ways that we can look and see that health actually is improved. So holistic nutrition has a remarkable effect in creating health. And there's only two main points. So all we need to remember: whole food, plant-based. Those two things. I was once on an expert panel in the late 1970s when I was being asked to explain to some cancer colleagues, what was this story about nutrition coming forth? And I didn't want to use the word vegan or vegetarian. I didn't know the word vegan at the time, but I did know about vegetarian. I did not want to use the word vegetarian because vegetarians don't do it quite right. And the argument for the vegetarian wasn't all that robust. So I come up with this crazy idea of calling it whole food plant-based. That was in the late 1970s. And so, as I say, there's 2 points here. It's really simple, really simple. Eat plants, just stay with the plants, whole variety, any improved vegetables, grains, etc. Eat the plants and try to, eat them in a way in which you get all the nutrients at the same time. That's in contrast to the way medicine is practiced, by the way. Medical practice here in this country and other Western countries, and where they think we tend to think this is really good. Reductionist medicine, I call it reductionist medicine, where we're focused on one disease, one cause of that one disease, one mechanism of that one cause. So in other words, we think with blinders on. We look at just one part of the whole. And that's what medicine is. We're focused on one part of the whole. We call it targeted drug effects. That's a byline for the entire pharmaceutical industry. They want to argue that this is a superior modern way of thinking about things, that we can develop a drug for virtually anything as long as we target it. That's not true. It sounds like a fancy idea, but the side effects are common, and we have to wrestle with the fact that whether or not we even get any benefits at all. Compared to nutrition, it's really minimal or nothing. This is why holistic nutrition is not taught in reductionist medical schools. There's not a medical school in the United States, and as far as I'm concerned, in Europe and other places where Western medicine is practiced, the Western medicine model is focused on this idea that if they can find one cause, working on one disease and target it, that's the best of medicine. It is not. And holistic nutrition, in contrast, can work the whole thing at the same time. And this is why medical schools don't teach nutrition at all. Medical schools don't teach nutrition because it's anathema to the kind of things that they've been trained to think about. If nutrition were taught, obviously there's less or even no need for drugs. This is why the public is so confused about nutrition. I've become very much aware, having been involved in policy development myself at the national and international levels. The public is terribly confused about nutrition, much more than they realize. Everybody seems to have their own ideas, perhaps, from time to time, and they seem to be sort of convinced what they're doing. But quite frankly, the public in general, as well as the professionals, presumably, advise the public what they should eat. We're all, the whole 9 yards, we're all together. We've been terribly confused about what nutrition is. And the reason for that, in large measure, is because we tend to think one nutrient at a time, one mechanism, maybe one drug to treat that one mechanism, one nutrient to treat that one mechanism. That's reductionist, and that's exactly the opposite. Reductionist medical schools don't want to teach holistic nutrition, put them out of business. So, will the present medical system allow this kind of thinking? I would hope so. It's tough. I would hope so, because that's when I showed that slide, swimming upstream and up of falls is sort of like that. It's a system that's in place. The medical system, we just sort of think it, that's it, that's everything. All I need to get is to get a drug. I don't need to worry about what to eat. I can eat the wrong food. And eventually they're going to get a drug to fix me up anyhow. So the present system will do everything it can to repress information like this as far as nutrition is concerned. I got caught up in this through my years. I obviously started my research career in 1956, now over 65 years ago, and mostly stayed with the same subject during my entire career. What does food do? What does food do? When I first started my career, I was in two professions at the time. One was pharmacology, because I didn't really know. One was pharmacology, the other was nutrition. And after about 10, 12 years or so, I dropped my association with the pharmacology. My community went over to nutrition because it was clear to me that nutrition was superior in terms of creating health. I summarized that in this book. I ran into a lot of difficulty over the years. That's a topic for another day. I ran into a lot of difficulty. People didn't care for what I was talking about, so I decided, and my wife is one that really pushed me to do this, stop complaining about what your colleagues are saying and the institutions are saying. Why don't you go out and write a book? So that's what I did. I wrote the book with my son, Thomas Campbell, right here. So he wrote the book. I didn't know how well it's going to do. I sold maybe 5,000, 8,000, maybe at the best 10,000 would cover the publisher thought that would cover its costs. It went far beyond that. Now it's well over 3 million. I think it's right around 4 million copies now sold. It has been translated to 50 foreign languages. It went far beyond anything I thought. And the reason I'm saying this, not to wave my own flag, but the reason I'm telling you this is because I lived in science. I'm trying to do things scientifically, and staying honest to the core, and having to refute my own thinking, my own lifestyle. And it's like, and thinking that science is going to be the answer of everything, but it doesn't work quite that way. The scientific community, unfortunately, is not what I thought it was, and it's getting worse. So the reason China said it was written, because my wife said, go out to the public and tell your story. I did, and the public has reacted. It's incredible. This was published first in 2005, republished again, advanced updated copy in 2016. The result has been spectacular. I also wrote another book in 2013 with Howard Jacobson, his doctorate in health sciences. I call it just a word, one word, whole. That's where, defending the proposition that if we look at in a scientific way, if we look at what whole food does compared to the individual nutrients in the food, we can get a result that's really spectacular. And finally, just a year ago, I came out with yet another book called The Future of Nutrition. There, I'm talking about some of the factors that repress our understanding nutrition. I did this with my grandson, actually, Nelson Diesler. This book here now has done really well, as I say, as well. So the feedback that has come as a result of telling the story in this way has irritated, unfortunately, my scientific colleagues. A lot of them intensely irritated them. They push back. The industry pushes back. But for the public, it's a different story. People, all they need to do, whatever state of health they're in, if they got problems, if they're diagnosed with this, that, or something else, all they need to do is switch their diet. Switch their diet. Whole food, plant-based. Just two ideas. Forget about, just acknowledge that this is an infinitely complex system, but set that aside. You don't need to know all science. Getting caught up in the details, it only causes confusion. Just remember two things. Eat plants. Stick with the plants. Good variety. Just stick with the plants and try to eat them in the whole food form. Let nature do its job. She's been around a lot longer than we have. She knows what she's doing. And so all we need to do is to put the right food in our mouth and get with it, and she'll do the rest in remarkably good ways. Now I'll go back to the beginning slide and make another cause here. There's what I came up with, the systemic crisis. I'm suggesting there is one cause. Just eat the wrong food. Just eat the right food. Excuse me. Just eat the right food. Human health will be dramatically improved. We get away from drugs and drug side effects and shorter life and all the rest of it. We can also really, this is a biggie here now, we can begin to solve the environmental course. Eat the right food. It's really simple. It's sustainable. Food production is sustainable that way. And the whole thing is cost effective. And the biggie, if we don't, we have to change the consumption of food now. It is by far and away the single most important thing we could do to save our planet. And as I was preparing this talk, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I saw this picture come out of the Los Angeles Times. It's almost emotional. It is emotional. It's sequoias, the 1,000, 2,000-year-old trees. The fires in California that's coming from environmental damage is now occurring. Look at this. More than 2,000 giant trees are dead or dying from that fire. I mean, just to see that, this tree and another couple of thousand like it have been around a couple of thousand years or more. And our climate is changing. Just think about that. That's just incredible. One thing I'd like to leave for your information too is we've got an online course. We've had it now for quite a long time. It's at Cornell University now. It's an online program at Cornell. It's a science-based approach to understanding nutrition. It's really been quite successful. We're very happy with it. You can get, if you're a professional of some sort, a nurse, a doctor, whatever, chiropractor, perhaps, you can get continuing medical education credits for taking the course. We've had a variety of really outstanding colleagues of mine and myself, and like son Tom especially, have offer the lectures. You can get it at nutritionstudies.org. And so there you have it. I am really have become, it's taken me 65 years to get to this point. Well, I don't care. I've raised at this point in time, I don't particularly care what kind of criticism I get. I've had to put up with it so long, I'm pretty crusty that way. I'm just going to tell what I thought I learned and what I have learned, not just for what others can do in terms of their health, what I did for myself too. My wife, my family, my friends. Change the food. Just eat the right food. It really is delicious if you stay with it. Sometimes people find it difficult to make the switch. And that's understandable. I mean, I know what it's like to make the switch. But after maybe 1, 2, maybe at the most 3 months for some folks, our taste preferences change. And when our taste preferences change, then we're over the hill. We're going down the other side. Because all of a sudden, then a salad, you crave a salad. And you crave this good food. And in the meanwhile, health just is like flowers growing in the field, just coming up. So get the health, you feel good about it, and you're doing a lot. We're all doing something together to save the planet. Thank you very much.